The morning sun cast long shadows across the police academy training field as a fresh group of recruits assembled in formation. The air was crisp with the promise of dawn, and the smell of dew-soaked grass mixed with the faint scent of rubber from worn running shoes. 23 young men and women stood in neat rows, their uniforms still creased from the package, their faces a mixture of excitement and nervous energy. "Man, I can't believe we're finally here," whispered Marcus, a tall recruit with broad shoulders who looked like he'd stepped straight out of a fitness magazine. He adjusted his cap and grinned at the woman next to him. "I know, right?" replied Sarah, her blonde hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail. 4 years of criminal justice classes, and now we're actually going to learn how to be real cops. The chatter continued as more recruits shared their anticipation. Some had dreamed of this moment since childhood, playing cops and robbers in their backyards. Others had come to this decision later in life, driven by a desire to serve their community or seeking a stable career with good benefits. "Hey, did anyone find out who's training us today?" asked Jake, a shorter recruit with an eager expression. "I heard some of the instructors here are real hardasses." "My cousin went through this academy 3 years ago," said another recruit, adjusting his belt. "He said there's this one instructor who's supposed to be some kind of legend. Made grown men cry during training." "Yeah, right," scoffed Marcus. "How tough can these old-timers really be? I mean, most of these guys are probably pushing retirement age." The group erupted in nervous laughter. They were young, confident, and ready to prove themselves. They had all passed the physical fitness tests, the psychological evaluations, and the background checks. They were the cream of the crop, or so they believed. As the minutes ticked by, the recruits began to wonder when their training would begin. The sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows, and the morning chill began to give way to the warmth of what promised to be a beautiful day. "There he is," Sarah suddenly said, pointing across the field. An old man was walking toward them from the direction of the main academy building. His pace was steady but unhurried, and there was something about his bearing that immediately commanded attention, even from a distance. As he drew closer, the recruits got a better look at their instructor. He appeared to be in his late 60s, maybe early 70s. His hair was silver gray, cropped short in a military style that spoke of decades of discipline. A thick mustache, also gray, covered his upper lip. He wore a faded academy jacket that had seen better days, and there was a slight limp in his step, as if an old injury had never quite healed properly. The man's face was weathered and lined, telling the story of countless hours spent in the sun and wind. His eyes, however, were sharp and alert, missing nothing as they swept over the assembled recruits. "You've got to be kidding me," Marcus muttered under his breath. "This guy looks like he should be sitting on a porch somewhere, not training police officers." A few of the other recruits snickered quietly. The old man certainly didn't look like the intimidating figure they had been expecting. If anything, he looked like someone's grandfather who had wandered onto the training field by mistake. "Maybe he's lost," whispered Jake. "Should we help him find his way to the bingo hall?" The comment drew more suppressed laughter from the group. They were young and cocky, and the sight of this elderly man approaching them as their instructor struck them as almost comical. "I bet he won't even be able to keep up with us during PT," Sarah said quietly. "I mean, look at him. He's probably older than my dad." The old man continued his approach, seemingly oblivious to the whispered comments, and barely concealed amusement of the recruits. When he finally reached them, he stopped about 10 feet away and looked them over with those sharp eyes. "Good morning, recruits," he said in a voice that was surprisingly strong and clear. "I'm your training instructor. We'll be spending the next several weeks together. And by the time I'm done with you, you'll either be ready to serve as police officers or you'll have found another line of work." The recruits straightened up slightly, but the amused glances continued to pass between them. This old man was going to train them? It seemed almost absurd. "Now, before we begin," the instructor continued, "I want to make something clear. I don't care who you are, where you came from, or what you think you know about police work. For the next few weeks, you belong to me. Is that understood?" A chorus of "Yes, sir," rose from the group, though it lacked the enthusiasm and respect that would have been present if they had been facing a younger, more physically imposing instructor. The old man nodded once, then turned and began walking toward the exercise area. "Follow me," he called over his shoulder. "We'll start with some basic warm-up exercises." As they walked, the recruits continued their whispered commentary. "Basic warm-up exercises," Marcus repeated mockingly. "I wonder if he means gentle stretching and maybe a slow walk around the track." "This is going to be a joke," agreed another recruit. "I was expecting military-style training, not senior aerobics." The old instructor led them to a large open area marked with white lines on the grass. Various pieces of exercise equipment were scattered around the perimeter, and a set of bleachers provided seating for observers. "All right, recruits," the instructor said, turning to face them. "We'll begin with some basic exercises. I want to see what kind of shape you're in and what we're working with." He gestured to the ground. "Everyone down for push-ups. Let's start with a set of 20. The recruits dropped to the ground with confidence. Push-ups were basic, and they had all been preparing for this moment. They were young, strong, and ready to show off their fitness levels. "Begin," the instructor said. The recruits started their push-ups, and for the first few repetitions, everything went smoothly. They maintained good form and kept pace with each other, determined to make a good impression despite their doubts about their instructor. But then something unexpected happened. The old man dropped to the ground beside them and began doing push-ups as well. At first, the recruits barely noticed. They were focused on their own exercises and maintaining their form. But as the count continued, it became impossible to ignore the fact that the elderly instructor was not only keeping up with them, but was executing each push-up with perfect form. His back was straight, his arms moved with mechanical precision, and his breathing was steady and controlled. There was no strain in his movements, no sign that the exercise was challenging him in any way. As they reached the count of 20, several of the recruits were beginning to feel the burn in their arms and shoulders. Marcus, despite his impressive physique, was starting to breathe heavily. 20, the instructor called out, rising smoothly to his feet. "Now let's do some sit-ups, 50 repetitions." Again the recruits assumed their positions, and again the old man joined them on the ground. This time they watched him more carefully as he performed the exercise. His movements were fluid and controlled, each sit-up executed with the same precision as the push-ups. There was no wasted motion, no struggle, just the steady rhythm of someone who had done this exercise thousands of times before. By the time they reached 30 repetitions, several recruits were struggling. Sarah's face was flushed, and Jake was beginning to lag behind the count. Come on, people, the instructor said, his voice showing no signs of exertion. We're not even halfway through yet. The recruits pushed through the remaining repetitions, but by the time they finished, most of them were breathing hard and sweating despite the cool morning air. Excellent, the instructor said, bouncing to his feet with surprising agility. Now let's do some lunges. 25 on each leg. The pattern continued. With each exercise, the old man demonstrated perfect form and seemingly endless endurance. He moved through lunges, jumping jacks and mountain climbers with the same effortless precision. Meanwhile, the recruits were beginning to struggle. These were supposed to be basic warm-up exercises, but the combination of the instructor's relentless pace and their own growing fatigue was taking its toll. Marcus, who had been so confident earlier, was now drenched in sweat. His perfect form was beginning to deteriorate, and he was fighting to keep up with the count. Sarah was in a similar straits, her blonde ponytail now dark with perspiration. She glanced at the instructor, who showed no signs of fatigue, and felt a growing sense of amazement mixed with embarrassment. The other recruits were faring no better. Jake was red-faced and gasping, while several others were beginning to falter in their movements. Through it all, the old man continued his exercises with machine-like consistency. His breathing remained steady, his form remained perfect, and his voice remained strong as he called out the counts. "What's the matter, people?" he asked during a brief rest between exercises. "I thought you were all in top physical condition." The recruits looked at each other with a mixture of exhaustion and newfound respect. This old man was not only keeping up with them, he was outperforming them. "Let's try some burpees," the instructor said. 20 repetitions. Burpees were one of the most demanding exercises in any fitness routine, combining elements of strength, cardio, and coordination. The recruits groaned inwardly but dropped into position. The old man joined them, and once again, his performance was flawless. He moved through each burpee with the same controlled precision, while the recruits struggled to maintain their form as fatigue set in. By the time they finished, several recruits were bent over, hands on their knees, gasping for breath. The morning sun was now fully up, and the combination of exertion and rising temperature had left them all drenched in sweat. The instructor, however, stood upright and relaxed, his breathing only slightly elevated. His gray mustache twitched slightly, and there might have been the hint of a smile in his eyes. "Not bad for a warm-up," he said. "Though I have to say, you youngsters seem to be having a harder time than I expected." The recruits looked at him with a mixture of awe and disbelief. This man, who had seemed so frail and elderly just an hour ago, had just outperformed all of them in a grueling series of exercises. Marcus straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Sir," he said, his voice still breathless, How are you doing this?" The old man studied him for a moment. "How am I doing what, recruit?" "The exercises, sir. You're not even winded." "And that surprises you?" "Well, yes, sir. I mean, no disrespect, but you're old," the instructor finished. "Is that what you're trying to say?" Marcus looked uncomfortable, but he nodded. "Yes, sir." The old man was quiet for a moment, his sharp eyes moving from recruit to recruit. "I see. And because I'm old, you assumed I would be weak, unable to keep up. Is that right?" The recruits shifted uncomfortably. When he put it that way, their assumptions seemed both obvious and embarrassing. Let me tell you something about assumptions, the instructor continued. They can get you killed in police work. When you look at a situation and make assumptions based on appearances, you're setting yourself up for failure. He walked slowly among the recruits, his limp more pronounced now, but his bearing still commanding. You looked at me this morning and saw an old man. You saw someone who was past his prime, someone who couldn't possibly teach you anything useful. You made assumptions based on what you thought you saw. Sarah raised her hand tentatively. Sir, we're sorry. We didn't mean any disrespect. Didn't you? The instructor asked. What were you saying about bingo halls earlier? Sarah's face flushed red. She hadn't thought the instructor had heard their whispered comments, but clearly he had heard everything. Assumptions, the instructor repeated. In police work, assumptions will get you hurt. You'll encounter suspects who look harmless, but are extremely dangerous. You'll face situations that appear simple, but are actually complex. And if you rely on assumptions instead of facts, you'll make mistakes that could cost lives. He stopped in front of Jake, who was still breathing heavily. What did you learn today, recruit? Jake thought for a moment. That appearances can be deceiving, sir. Good. What else? That we shouldn't underestimate people based on their age or appearance. Better. Anyone else? Marcus raised his hand. Sir, I think we learned that experience and technique can be more important than youth and strength. The instructor nodded approvingly. Now you're beginning to understand. Physical fitness is important in police work, but it's not everything. Experience, technique, and mental toughness are just as valuable, if not more so. He walked back to the center of the group. I've been doing these exercises for longer than some of you have been alive. I know how to pace myself, how to breathe, how to maintain form under stress. These are skills that come with experience. The recruits listened intently, their earlier amusement completely forgotten. They were beginning to realize that their instructor was not the feeble old man they had assumed him to be. Now, the instructor continued, I want to tell you something about this badge I'm wearing. For the first time, the recruits really looked at the badge on his chest. It was old and worn, the metal tarnished with age, but there was something distinctive about it. Sarah squinted at it, trying to make out the details. Sir, is that badge number, is that a 001? The instructor looked down at his badge, then back at the recruits. That's right. Badge number 001. The recruits looked at each other in confusion. Sir, what does that mean? Asked Jake. The old man reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted a laminated card that had yellowed with age. He held it up for the recruits to see. This is my original academy graduation certificate, when he said, dated 47 years ago. I was the first cadet to graduate from this academy when it opened its doors. The recruits stared at the certificate in stunned silence. 47 years. This man had been a police officer for nearly half a century. I was also the first sworn officer hired by this academy as an instructor, he continued. That was 38 years ago. Since then, I've trained over 3,000 police officers. The weight of this revelation began to sink in. This wasn't just some old man who had wandered onto the training field. This was a living piece of police history. Sir, Marcus said quietly, how many officers have you trained? As I said, over 3,000. But it's not just about the numbers. It's about the quality of officers we've produced. Just then, a figure approached from the direction of the main academy building. It was Captain Rodriguez, the Academy's commanding officer, a stern-looking woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes. "Good morning, recruits," Captain Rodriguez said as she joined the group. "I see you've met your training instructor." "Yes, ma'am," the recruits replied in unison, their voices now filled with respect rather than the casual indifference they had shown earlier. Captain Rodriguez looked at the old instructor with obvious admiration. "Recruits, I want you to understand exactly who you're working with. This man has trained 3 generations of police officers. Every decorated officer you've read about, every hero cop whose story has made the news, every chief of police in this state, they all learned their craft from him." She gestured towards the instructor. "The commissioner of police, trained by this man. The chief of detectives, trained by this man. The special operations commander, also trained by this man." The recruits stood a little taller, their eyes wide with newfound understanding. They were in the presence of a legend. "In fact," Captain Rodriguez continued, "I was trained by him myself 22 years ago. Everything I know about police work, I learned from him." She turned to address the instructor directly. "Sir, these recruits are lucky to have you." The old man nodded once, acknowledging the compliment with quiet dignity. "Thank you, Captain." After Captain Rodriguez left, the instructor turned back to the recruits. "Now you understand why I do what I do. It's not about the money or the recognition. It's about preparing you for the challenges you'll face as police officers." He began walking slowly around the group, his limp more noticeable now, but his presence still commanding. "Police work is dangerous," he said. "You'll face situations that test every aspect of your training. You'll encounter people who want to hurt you, and you'll be responsible for protecting people who can't protect themselves." He stopped in front of Sarah. "You'll make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. You'll see things that will stay with you for the rest of your life." Moving to Jake, he continued, "You'll be called upon to show courage when you're terrified, to remain calm when everything around you is chaos, and to make the right choice even when all the options seem wrong." The recruits listened intently, beginning to understand the weight of responsibility they were preparing to take on. "That's why your training is so important," the instructor said. "That's why I push you so hard. That's why I demand excellence from every one of you." He returned to the center of the group. "I've seen too many good officers get hurt because they weren't properly prepared. I've attended too many funerals of officers who thought they knew everything they needed to know." The morning sun was now high in the sky, and the training field was beginning to get busy with other academy activities. In the distance, another group of recruits was running laps around the track. "Sir," Marcus said, "can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "How do you do it? How do you stay motivated to keep training recruits after all these years?" The old man was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "Because every officer I train might be the one who saves someone's life. Every recruit who goes through this academy might be the one who makes a difference in their community." He looked at each of them in turn. "One of you might become the next commissioner of police. One of you might solve a case that brings justice to a victim's family. One of you might be the officer who talks someone down from a ledge or stops a crime in progress." The recruits felt the weight of his words. They were no longer just young people seeking stable careers. They were future guardians of their communities. "That's why I do this," the instructor continued. Because every officer I train carries a piece of my knowledge and experience with them. When they make a good decision in the field, when they handle a difficult situation correctly, when they show courage under fire. That's my legacy. The morning's training session was coming to an end, but the instructor had one more lesson to impart. I want you to run 5 laps around the track, he said, not as a punishment, but as a reminder. Every step you take in training is a step toward becoming the officer your community needs. The recruits lined up at the starting line, their attitude completely transformed from earlier in the morning. They were no longer cocky young people looking to prove themselves. They were students eager to learn from a master. As they began to run, the instructor stood at the edge of the track, watching them with the same sharp eyes that had observed thousands of recruits over the decades. Sarah ran past him on the first lap and slowed slightly. "Sir, thank you," she said as she passed. The old man nodded once, a small smile creasing his weathered face. "Just remember what you learned today, recruit." As the recruits continued their laps, other academy personnel began to take notice. Instructors from other classes paused to watch, many of them former students of the old man themselves. A young instructor approached him. "How are the new recruits looking, sir?" "They have potential," the old man replied. "They started the morning thinking they knew everything. They're ending it knowing they have everything to learn." That's progress. Indeed it is. The recruits completed their laps, breathing hard but showing no signs of complaint. They lined up in formation, waiting for their next instruction. "That's enough for today," the instructor said. "Report back here tomorrow morning at 0600 hours. We'll continue with defensive tactics training." As the recruits began to disperse, Marcus lingered behind. "Sir, can I ask you one more question?" "What is it, recruit?" "What's the most important thing you've learned in all your years of police work?" The old man thought for a moment. "That every person you encounter is someone's son or daughter, someone's parent or sibling. Even the criminals, even the people who do terrible things. They're all human beings who deserve to be treated with dignity." He adjusted his faded jacket. "That doesn't mean you let them hurt you or others. It means you do your job with professionalism and integrity, even when it's difficult." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, sir." As the recruits walked back toward the academy building, they talked among themselves in hushed, respectful tones. Their conversation was very different from the casual banter they had shared earlier. "Can you believe we thought he was just some old man?" Sarah said, shaking her head. "I feel like such an idiot," Jake replied. "We were so arrogant." "The important thing is that we learn something," Marcus said. "That's what training is for, right?" Over the following weeks, the recruits' respect for their instructor only grew. He pushed them harder than any of them had ever been pushed before. But they understood now that every challenge was designed to prepare them for the realities of police work. He taught them about de-escalation techniques, showing them how to calm angry citizens with words rather than force. He demonstrated proper arrest procedures, emphasizing the importance of protecting suspects' rights even while ensuring officer safety. During firearms training, his expertise was legendary. Despite his age, he could outshoot any of the recruits, placing shot after shot in the center of the target with mechanical precision. "Shooting is about more than just accuracy," he would tell them. "It's about knowing when to shoot and when not to. It's about understanding that drawing your weapon changes everything." He shared stories from his decades of experience, but never in a boastful way. Each story was a lesson, a teaching moment designed to prepare them for similar situations they might face. There was the time he had talked an armed robbery suspect into surrendering without violence. The domestic violence call that had turned into a hostage situation. The traffic stop that had led to the discovery of a kidnapping victim. Every call is different, he would say, but the principles remain the same. Stay alert, stay professional, and remember that your job is to protect and serve. The recruits learned to appreciate not just his knowledge and experience, but his character. He was fair but demanding, strict but caring. He never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself, and he never gave up on a recruit who was struggling. When Jake had trouble with the physical fitness requirements, the instructor worked with him one-on-one, helping him develop the strength and endurance he needed. When Sarah struggled with firearms training, he spent extra time with her at the range, patiently correcting her grip and stance until she improved. As graduation day approached, the recruits realized how much they had changed since that first morning on the training field. They were no longer the cocky young people who had made jokes about their elderly instructor. They were disciplined, knowledgeable, and prepared for the challenges ahead. On the final day of training, the instructor gathered them together one last time on the same field where they had first met. "Recruits," he said, "in a few hours, you'll graduate from this academy. You'll receive your badges and take your oath as police officers. But remember that your real education is just beginning." He looked at each of them, his sharp eyes taking in their transformation. "You'll face situations that weren't covered in any textbook. You'll make decisions that will test everything you've learned here. And when that happens, I want you to remember what you learned on this field." Sarah raised her hand. "Sir, what did we learn on this field?" "That appearances can be deceiving, that assumptions can be dangerous, that experience and wisdom are valuable regardless of age or appearance." He paused, his voice growing more serious, "and that every person you encounter deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, even when they don't extend the same courtesy to you." The recruit stood in formation, listening to these final words from the man who had transformed them from civilians into police officers. "I'm proud of all of you," the instructor continued. "You've worked hard, you've learned well, and you're ready to serve your communities. But remember, being a police officer is not just a job. It's a calling. It's a commitment to something greater than yourself." As the graduation ceremony began, the recruits took their places among the hundreds of other officers who had been trained by the same man over the decades. Chiefs of police, detectives, patrol officers, and federal agents, all united by their shared experience under his guidance. The keynote speaker was the state police commissioner, a distinguished woman who had graduated from the academy 20 years earlier. In her speech, she made special mention of the training instructor who had shaped so many careers. "There are teachers, and then there are legends," she said. "The man who trained most of us here today is both. His influence extends far beyond this academy, far beyond this state. He has shaped the very culture of modern law enforcement." After the ceremony, as the new officers celebrated with their families, the old instructor quietly made his way back to his office. There, on his desk, was a pile of applications from the next group of recruits who would begin training the following week. He opened the first file and began to read. Another group of young people, full of confidence and assumptions, ready to learn what it really meant to be a police officer. A knock on his door interrupted his reading. Marcus stood in the doorway, still wearing his dress uniform from the graduation ceremony. "Sir, I wanted to thank you one more time." The old man looked up from the files. "Thank me for what, officer?" "For teaching us that real strength comes from experience, not just youth. For showing us that wisdom is more valuable than arrogance. For preparing us for what's really out there." The instructor stood up and walked around his desk. "Officer, the best way to thank me is to be the kind of police officer your community needs. Be fair, be professional, and never stop learning." He shook Marcus's hand firmly. "And remember, someday you might be the one training the next generation. When that day comes, pass on what you've learned." As Marcus left the office, the old instructor returned to his desk and the pile of applications. Outside his window, he could see the training field where tomorrow's officers would begin their journey. He picked up his pen and began making notes on the first application. After 47 years, he was still learning, still growing, still preparing for the next group of recruits who would walk onto that field thinking they knew everything. The cycle would continue, as it had for decades. Young officers would come full of confidence and assumptions. They would learn, grow, and eventually graduate to serve their communities. And some of them would return years later as experienced officers themselves to train the next generation. The old instructor smiled slightly as he worked. It was good work, important work. And as long as there were young people willing to serve and protect, he would be there to train them. After all, someone had to teach them that legends weren't always what they seemed to be.